Hey, welcome back, it's RespectTheJeff here, and I wanted to try something new and do a detailed video on FIFA 20's new morale system. It's a feature that got added with little to no explanation, so I'm going to walk you through the basics of player morale, and then get into more depth and actually analyze the true impact of morale on a player's overall. But before we dive all the way in, let's talk a bit about how morale works. Now, it's sort of the evolution of the form system that's been in the game for a long time now. However, morale actually changes your player's stats in the game, which is completely new. Now, how is player morale calculated? A player's morale is based off of the player performance, the play time, the team performance, and the player's contract, and you can see that all in the game. And there's 5 possibilities for player morale. The default one, content, means there's no changes at all. The player's exactly like you'd expect and their stats reflect the way they're going to play. The other 4 are happy, unhappy, very happy, and very unhappy. Obviously, the 2 varies have more of an impact on stats than the other 2. Now, in your team management view, you can actually see how your players are being affected by morale next to each one of their stats. So right away, I was intrigued by how this new system works. The game shows you clearly which stats are affected by morale and by exactly how much. But they don't reflect this in the players overall, which left me really curious as to how much of an impact this is actually having on my players. So I took this chance to do a little bit of testing and get to the bottom of things. And in the process, I found some very interesting things about player morale. The first being that morale is not that dynamic. In fact, it looks like for any given position, the morale changes always show up on the exact same stats. And more than that, these changes come with the exact same numbers as well. So if a player is happy or unhappy, you're always going to see values of 2, 3, or 5 applied to their stats. And if a player is very unhappy or very happy, you're going to see values of 3, 5, or 8 in the same places that the 2, 3, 5 were shown in the other example. So it makes things really predictable. These values always seem to be the same for each position too, and there really doesn't appear to be any variation at all. And to make things even less complicated, the values are the same between happy and unhappy, or very happy and very unhappy, except that they just become negative in the bad cases. It's pretty much like if a striker is happy, apply this exact set of values to these stats. Or if maybe a center back is unhappy, apply these exact set of negative values to these stats. So this is pretty predictable, but you can't tell exactly how much this is going to impact your players overall. Well, it actually turns out though we can figure this out. Since we know that morale always works in the same exact way, and we can figure out how player overall is calculated, we can figure out exactly how much a change to these stats will affect the overall rating for any given position. So for each important position in the game, I laid out exactly where and how much morale affects each statistic. And you can see them laid out. For a lot of these, morale will never affect it. You take heading accuracy or volleys, even short passing, which is kind of surprising, it'll never be affected by morale. Now there's a lot of these that are shared in common, so I kind of grouped them together. It seems like strikers are in a category of their own. And then any other generally offensive player seems to be lumped in with the same midfield group. So right wingers to center mids, even like defensive mids, they all have the same exact sets applied to them. You can see center backs and fullbacks have these same values applied to the same stats. And of course, goalkeepers are in a complete group of their own as well. These stats only affect the goalkeeping traits, so we don't need to worry about it outside of the scope of them. But right now, this is a lot to look at. So I took all of these and I boiled them down into a list of only the traits that get affected by morale. So you can see up here at the top, there's a common set of traits that get affected for all of the outfield players. There's another small grouping where positioning affects both striker and midfield players. And then the rest of these are only applied to their specific subset. So strikers see a change with finishing, long shots, and shot power, where any type of midfield is going to have their dribbling, ball control, and vision affected as well. And you can see here, I laid out all the possibilities for each value. So if you're looking at just happy or unhappy, you're going to get values of 2, 3, or 5, which I'm calling small, medium, and large. It doesn't really matter that much though. When you look at very unhappy or very happy, these same ones will correspond to each other, but it will be 3, 5, and 8 instead. So now how do these affect a player's overall? Well, to figure that out, we're gonna need to take a look at how overall is calculated. Okay, so I know this looks like a lot, but it's pretty straightforward actually. Every player stat is given a certain weight depending on where they play in the field. And we can actually figure this out in game. When you create a new player, if you make all of their stats 1 and slowly increment each one up individually, you can see how many increases are needed to see a rise in 1 point overall. And the game just calculates overall by adding all of these important stats together. So all you need to do is take the weight of a stat and multiply it by the player's actual value in that stat. And then you'll get a number here, which is how much each stat adds to the overall of each position. And when you do this for every individual stat and you add them all up, you get the player's overall. So here I used Kurt Zouma as an example. Now obviously he's a center back. So when you look at all the weights here, you multiply them together and you add them into an overall, you get 79. Now this is actually a little bit off because in the game, Kurt Zouma is rated at 80. Now there's a couple reasons this could be happening. One is that the game adds international reputation as a trait for some players. And this is kind of their way of adjusting overalls for players who might not have the most outstanding stats, but are sort of well known and people would expect them to be rated higher. Another possibility is that I got the calculations slightly wrong. This is obviously very close to being accurate, but you can't edit things like composure in the in-game editor, so it's possible that my calculations here are just a tiny bit off, but for the purposes of showing how morale affects this, it should get us really close to use this kind of math. So hopefully that helped you understand player overall a little bit better. Okay, so we have which stats are affected by morale, and we have which stats matter for player overall. So if we put these in a list and break it down by position, we can take the weight of the stat that we just looked at and multiply that by the change that morale has on it. So for a striker here, reactions are important. So you can see in the standard morale column, which would be happy or unhappy, this will be multiplied by 5. And that gives us a value of 0.5. If you move down the list and you look at all of these, you can add all of these together to figure out how much that's going to change your player's overall. In this case, it would be 2.94, or roughly 3 overall, which is actually very significant. And if you look at the very column, which would be very happy or very unhappy, this is even more significant, and actually creeps up on 5. So each position has its own unique weights for all of the stats, and each grouping for striker, midfielder, defender, goalkeeper, all has different morale values. So that just leaves us with a ton of different combinations here, and you can see the totals down at the bottom. Now what's very interesting about this is there's actually a decent bit of variation, meaning that form doesn't affect every position the same way. Now I know there's a ton going on the screen here, so I simplified things and just got it down to the pure numbers. And here you have it, it's the overall impact of morale by position. And I listed it out with the highest impact at the top and the lowest on the bottom. And the results are pretty crazy actually. Goalkeepers have by far the biggest variation depending on their morale. A very happy or very unhappy goalkeeper can go up or down by 6. I mean, that's enormous. That's even the difference between a quality goalkeeper like maybe Pickford for Everton, who's an 83, and a lot of benchwarmer goalkeepers in the same league who are around 77. Or if you look at it the other way, take a top keeper like Oblak that I think is 91 or 92 rated, he gets into the high 90s with the +6. And at that point, he's going to be basically unstoppable in game. So keeping your goalie in good form is vital. Or if he's in bad form, it might really warrant a start for your backup goalkeeper. But there's a bunch of other positions that are really affected as well, center backs and strikers particularly, because they're so reliant on technique, and the morale that gets applied to these positions is really targeted to what they do best. Now there's a few in the middle, and then at the very bottom of the list, you have center defensive mid. If we go back and we look at how each stat was affected by position with morale, you can see that important defensive stats like interceptions, marking, standing, and sliding tackle, they only apply to defensive positions, which I guess in this case would only be considered center backs and fullbacks. So the defensive mid position, which is calculated using some of those stats as being important, gets away relatively unharmed. The stats that do get impacted from midfield, like dribbling, ball control, and vision, I mean, they're definitely important for a defensive mid, but they're just not going to bring down his overall as much. And honestly, they shouldn't impact the way he plays quite as much either. Okay, so what are the key takeaways here? I think the number one is that morale matters. With a lot of players going up or down by as much as 5 or 6 overall, that's going to make a huge impact on the way your team is playing. But the other key takeaway here is that morale doesn't affect all these players the same way. As we discussed, goalkeepers, center backs, strikers, they all have a lot to gain or lose here. And keeping them happy or rotating them properly if they're unhappy is going to be vital to you succeeding. And I think other players you just don't have to worry about as much. Both center defensive mids and even just standard center mids don't have quite as much to gain or lose. In fact, as we discussed for defensive mids, it could be the difference of 1 or 2 overall points. Now you could definitely still feel the difference, but it's not going to be as dramatic as some of these other spots. So hopefully you can use this list to evaluate better which players you should be starting or not, and how you can affect their morale. Because as we've seen, it does make a big difference. Alright, well thank you so much for watching. I've appreciated all the support so far. If you like this new type of content, feel free to drop a comment and let me know, or if you have anything else to add about player morale that I forgot to include, I would love to hear that as well. And again, if you're enjoying these videos, please subscribe and stay up to date, and I'll keep rolling new ones out. But until then, I'm RespectTheJeff, and I'll see you next time.